In the late 17th century, at the crossroads of piracy and science, one figure stood uniquely astride both worlds. William Dampier, former buccaneer, self-taught naturalist, and unorthodox navigator, was entrusted with a ship and a mission that would quietly alter the trajectory of British exploration. His vessel, HMS Roebuck, was a modest and aging warship, a repurposed fireship of uncertain distinction, yet in 1699 she carried the Royal Navy's first official scientific expedition to the coasts of New Holland, now known today as Australia. This voyage marked the beginning of Britain's systematic engagement with the Pacific, decades before Cook and centuries before Australia became part of the Empire. It was a voyage undertaken not for conquest, but for observation, an effort to chart unknown lands, to record new species, and perhaps to earn a fortune in a still mysterious hemisphere. Today, we're going to retrace that journey, the transformation of Roebuck, the peculiar appointment of Dampier himself, the scientific and geographic work conducted along the coasts of New Holland and New Guinea, and the expedition's dramatic end, lost to the mid-Atlantic and rediscovered 3 centuries later. It's the story of a warship never designed for scientific expeditions, commanded by a man who shouldn't have been chosen, and yet both would leave their mark on the history of naval exploration. So, let's start with the ship. HMS Roebuck was launched on the 17th of April 1690 from the yards of Master Shipwright Thomas Snelgrove in Wapping, East London. She wasn't designed for endurance or elegance. Roebuck was one of 12 purpose-built fireships, floating weapons of last resort, packed with combustibles, intended to be ignited and directed towards enemy lines. It was, by definition, a disposable class of ship. At launch, Roebuck was modest by the standards of the Royal Navy. She displaced 292 tons burthen, measured approximately 96 feet in length and 25.5 feet at the beam, and bore a sparse armament of just 8 guns. Her first appearance in combat came swiftly at the Battle of Beachy Head in June 1690, though her specific role there remains poorly documented. By the mid-1690s, however, Roebuck was repurposed. Around 1695, she underwent a significant refit and was reclassified as a 5th-rate warship, formerly listed with 26 guns. But this figure, like much about Roebuck, remains ambiguous. Contemporary records, or more accurately, the acute lack thereof, have led to persistent disagreement regarding the vessel's actual configuration. According to one authoritative source, the Naval Encyclopedia, she may have carried as few as 12 guns on Dampier's voyage. This discrepancy highlights a broad difficulty, as no detailed plans of Roebuck are known to survive. As a result, all visual representations of the ship are necessarily speculative. Notional images, educated guesses based on the ships of similar class and date, have filled the void left by archival absence. What is certain is this: by the end of the decade, Roebuck was no longer a fireship, and not quite a frigate. She was something in between, and she was about to be pressed into scientific service at a time when such a term scarcely existed within naval doctrine. By 1698, HMS Roebuck, in her new configuration, had been idle for some time. Then, in July of that year, she was placed under the command of William Dampier. William Dampier was, to put it mildly, an unusual choice for command. A former buccaneer with no formal naval rank, he wasn't the sort of man the Admiralty typically handed a Royal Navy ship to. And yet, he had accomplished something few privateers ever had. He'd caught the enthusiastic attention of the British establishment, not by force of arms, but by force of prose. Born in 1651 in Somerset, Dampier emerged from the more respectable end of obscurity. From a young age, he showed a singular talent for doing things the hard way. At 18, he crossed the Atlantic to Newfoundland, enduring temperate storms and disease. A few years later, he was aboard an East Indiaman bound for Java, enduring tropical storms and disease. Clearly, he had a taste for long journeys, trying circumstances, and remote destinations. He returned to England briefly, joined the Royal Navy, fought in the Third Dutch War, and was hospitalised in 1673, the exact reasons for which are unknown. By 1674, he'd had enough of European conflict and he shipped out to Jamaica, where he tried his hand at plantation work. It didn't go particularly well. His plantation manager described him as a self-conceited young man, with a tendency to ramble and an aversion to settling down. In other words, Dampier was an 18th century graduate with a gap year problem. He soon, unsurprisingly, absconded again, this time to cut logwood in the swamps of the Bay of Campeche. There, knee-deep in brackish water and surrounded by mosquitoes, snakes, and the occasional alligator, he took up a habit that would define the rest of his life: writing things down. His early journals documented the daily hazards of his trade: disease, predators, and Spanish patrols unimpressed by British deforestation efforts on their side of the map. But they also contained something rarer: careful notes on wind, tides, local wildlife, and tropical storms. One of his notebooks, soaked during a hurricane and painstakingly dried by a campfire, included what are now recognized as some of the first scientific observations of hurricanes in the Western Hemisphere. Dampier's talent was becoming clear: the eye of a naturalist, the grit of a sailor, and an uncanny ability to survive things he probably shouldn't have attempted in the first place. In the 1680s, he fell in with a band of buccaneers raiding the Spanish Main, a period best described as part science, part piracy, and part implausible adventure, and we'll definitely be covering those escapades in another episode later on. But to cut a long story short, when he finally returned to England in 1691, Dampier had spent over a decade circumnavigating the globe. Some buccaneers brought back treasure, but Dampier brought something considered far more valuable: notebooks. Oh, and a tattooed slave by the name of Prince Joly. Dampier's account of his piratical/philosophical adventure, A New Voyage Round the World, became a publishing sensation in 1697. This extraordinary account of 13 years wandering across the globe combined narrative flair with ethnographic detail and naturalistic observations. It was a commercial success and a scientific curiosity, praised by readers ranging from sea captains to philosophers. And, most importantly, it convinced the British Admiralty that this rambling ex-privateer might just be the man to send out into the unknown. Encouraged by King William III and backed by the Royal Society, Dampier was authorised to lead an official expedition to the South Seas, with the goal of finding Terra Australis, the first of its kind with scientific aims. Now, as a quick aside and to avoid confusion, Terra Australis did not refer to the continent that we now know as Australia. That at the time was known as New Holland. Terra Australis was a hypothesized seventh continent located deep in the southern hemisphere. Centuries later, it would be known by a different name: Antarctica. Anyway, back to Dampier's expedition. His instructions were fairly straightforward: survey the coast of New Holland, search for Terra Australis incognita, and bring back information useful to navigation, commerce, and natural philosophy. He was to make careful observations, collect samples of plants and animals, and, if opportunity allowed, secure some of the natives, provided they should be willing to come along, or so it went. Most importantly though, he was to keep an exact journal of the voyage and deliver it to the Admiralty. In terms of naval logistics, the mission was modest. Roebuck, now rated as a 26th gun ship, retained her approximate tonnage of 290 to 292 tons. Her crew varied between 50 and 125 men, far fewer than a ship of her rating typically carried, and the preparation for the voyage was far from ideal. Dampier requested 2 vessels, but was given 1, already showing signs of disrepair. He had never commanded a ship of war, his scientific credentials were self-taught, and his leadership experience was largely anecdotal. Yet with all this, Roebuck set sail in early 1699, a vessel of uncertain quality, led by a captain of uncertain rank, bound for lands that, to most people in Britain, scarcely existed beyond the edge of the map. On the 14th of January 1699, HMS Roebuck departed England. Dampier's intended route, westward via Cape Horn, was rendered unviable by seasonal winds. Instead, he took the more conventional passage south to the Cape of Good Hope. From the outset, discipline aboard the Roebuck was uneven. Dampier, despite his credentials as a voyager and observer, had little experience with formal naval command, and it showed. His leadership style, shaped by years among privateers and self-governed crews, clashed with the expectations of the Royal Navy hierarchy. Chief among his problems was Lieutenant George Fisher, his second-in-command, and increasingly his adversary. The two clashed over pretty much everything, matters of navigation, authority, and personal conduct. Dampier accused Fisher of insubordination, and Fisher for his part accused Dampier of drunkenness and incompetence. The conflict soon escalated beyond sharp words. By the time Roebuck reached the coast of Brazil, Dampier had Fisher clapped in irons and summarily put ashore. Now, the removal of a commissioned officer in foreign waters was a serious act, one that would later feature prominently in Dampier's court-martial. For now, it left the ship without a reliable second officer, and it deepened divisions among the remaining crew. Reports of indiscipline, grumbling, and outright fisticuffs would continue throughout the voyage. Not exactly the image of orderly scientific exploration that the Admiralty may have been hoping for. Despite these difficulties though, Roebuck eventually arrived on the western coast of New Holland in August of that year. It was not Dampier's first visit to the continent. He had briefly landed there on the northwestern coast in 1688, but it was his first under formal commission. Interestingly, despite the earlier drama with Lieutenant Fisher and the general air of discontent aboard Roebuck, there were no surviving records of serious disciplinary trouble during the Australian leg of the voyage. Whether this was due to Dampier's improved leadership, the crew's wariness, lost records during the ship's later foundering, or the simple distraction of entirely unfamiliar surroundings, history doesn't say. But for a moment, it seemed that observation triumphed over argument. The ship first anchored in Shark Bay on the 7th of August 1699, a name Dampier chose for reasons that quickly became apparent to his crew. The coastline was largely arid and uninviting, but it was here that Dampier began his systematic observations of the land and its natural history. Despite his disappointment with the soil quality, which he described as dry and sandy, Dampier carefully recorded the local environment, making notes on plants and animal life. One of his most famous observations involved the peculiar locomotion of a hopping marsupial, now recognized as one of the first European descriptions of a kangaroo. He collected numerous botanical specimens, including what would later be classified as Swainsona formosa, or Sturt's desert pea. These samples, dried and preserved aboard the Roebuck, would eventually be deposited with the Royal Society and later passed on to the University of Oxford. Equally notable were his ethnographic observations. Dampier encountered local Aboriginal people in the region and wrote extensively about their appearance, customs, and technology, though always through the lens of 17th century European assumptions. His descriptions were frequently dismissive and filtered by his own cultural biases. He referred to them as the miserablest people in the world. Yet these remain some of the earliest English language records of Indigenous Australian people. He noted their physical agility, their diet, their fire-making methods, and their use of spears and canoes, as well as their complete unfamiliarity with Europeans. For several more weeks, the expedition skirted the coastline, making observations, taking soundings, and collecting botanical specimens. From New Holland, Roebuck continued through the Timor Sea to the coast of New Guinea. There, Dampier circumnavigated a large landmass he named Nova Britannia, modern-day New Britain, proving it to be an island and thus correcting earlier cartographic errors. He then passed through the strait that would eventually bear his name. His intention had been to push farther, ideally reaching the uncharted eastern coast, but it was here that the expedition hit trouble. Roebuck, never in sound condition to begin with, had deteriorated considerably. Shipworms had bored into her timbers, and it was felt that she was no longer seaworthy enough for extended survey work. By early 1700, Dampier abandoned his plan to explore eastern Australia. With the hull weakening and the crew getting worried, he sailed westward towards Batavia for emergency repairs. Unfortunately, these repairs proved insufficient, and it was decided eventually to abandon the expedition altogether and return to England with all practicable speed before the ship fell apart. Unfortunately, Roebuck could not outsail her own disintegration. On the 21st of February 1701, near Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic, Roebuck began to flood uncontrollably. The leak gained prodigiously, and all attempts to stem it failed. With no alternative, Dampier chose to ground the ship deliberately and evacuated his men to the shore. Some supplies were salvaged. Crucially, his journals and a portion of his scientific specimens were saved from total destruction. The crew spent 5 weeks marooned on the barren island before being rescued by a passing East India Company vessel. Roebuck herself had sunk shortly thereafter, her hull lost beneath the waters of Clarence Bay. Now, upon returning to England, eventually, Dampier did not receive the acclaim he might have expected. Instead, he faced a court-martial. The charges were twofold: the loss of Roebuck and his alleged mistreatment of Lieutenant Fisher. The Admiralty found him guilty of very hard and cruel usage, stripped him of pay, and declared him unfit to command another of His Majesty's vessels. It was a formal censure and an informal exile from any future naval authority. Yet, professionally ruined within the Navy, Dampier retained one asset: his pen. In 1703, he published A Voyage to New Holland, the first in a projected series recounting his latest expedition. The book received considerable attention. It reaffirmed his position as a skilled observer, an engaging writer, and one of the few individuals to bridge the age of piracy and the coming age of enlightened exploration. His botanical collections, those that survived the wreck, were donated to the Royal Society and later housed in the University of Oxford. Some of these specimens remain today, quietly testifying to the endurance of Dampier's scientific impulses. His ideas, too, endured. Charles Darwin would later cite Dampier's writings during his own voyage aboard HMS Beagle. Captain James Cook, though operating under more formalized protocols, echoed many of Dampier's methods in combining empirical observation with global navigation. For centuries, the location of Roebuck's wreck remained uncertain. Conflicting accounts and missing records obscured her final resting place. But in March 2001, 300 years after her loss, a team from the Western Australia Maritime Museum identified the wreck site in Clarence Bay. Among the debris, divers recovered fragments of Chinese porcelain, concreted iron anchors, and a brass ship's bell. These artifacts, consistent with Roebuck's documented itinerary, confirmed the vessel's identity. A detailed study then followed, aided by the rediscovery of the original shipbuilding contract at the National Archives. As a result, a 1:24 scale model of the Roebuck was produced and placed on public display. Today, the voyage of HMS Roebuck is recognized not as a failure, but as a beginning. Dampier's command was fraught, and his reputation divided, but his contributions to cartography, natural history, and the British colonial imagination marked a quiet turning point. He was perhaps an improbable explorer, yet the questions he asked, and the specimens he carried home, signaled the dawn of a new era of discovery. And that, my friends, concludes our brief story about Dampier and HMS Roebuck. There are, of course, many more events from Dampier's life, and indeed that of many other nautical explorers, that are worth discussing. So we hope you stick around for more tales of nautical history in the future. And, as always, remember to choose the lesser of two evils.